considerations when developing and implementing an open access policy. So there's two aspects to what I want to talk about today. One is the question of what makes a good open access policy, and the other one is how you can work with your organisation to implement that policy. And these sound simple in some ways, but they are actually quite complicated. So starting with what makes a good open access policy. This photograph is a photograph of what is called a dovecote. That is a kind of structure that's used to be on lands in England, and it's sort of circular from the outside, and it's got little holes in there, as you can see, and that's where the doves go and sit and nest. So a lot of my photographs that I use in my slides are from my travels around the world. So if we think about the question about what makes a good open access policy, the work that I'm referring to here could have some clues. It's a publication called Free for All or Free for All, a content analysis of Australian university open access policies. There's a bit of a play on words there, so which might not be clear if you're not a native English speaker. So what we did in this research is what I'm going to talk about initially. So we had a range of people on the research team. So these are the people you could contact if you're interested in this research to have a conversation with them afterwards, because the slides will be available. So when we first did the research, we published the work as a preprint. So we put it onto bioRxiv, which is a preprint server, to make it openly available at the same time that we submitted it for consideration for publication. And it was the preprint that was picked up and referenced in this particular paper or a news article that was published in Nature Index. And that paper was talking about what's happening in Australia at the moment, which is that the chief scientist is talking about open access as one of the issues she'd like to try and find a resolution for. And so the commentary in the paper, in this particular news article, was referring to the work we'd done analysing open access policies. And as I said, it wasn't actually the paper that Nature referenced. So here's an image of the preprint, and we put the preprint online initially on the 20th of August in 2021, and then made some amendments to it and reposted it to version 2 on the 12th of September. Then a month after that, the Nature piece was published. And then it was only about 2 weeks ago that I was Googling this paper because I wanted to refer to it in something, and I discovered that the paper had actually been published, finally published. The journal hadn't told us that it had been published. None of my co-authors knew. I emailed them to say, guess what? Our paper's now published. But in fact, the activity and interest and the initial value of the paper was when it was published as a preprint rather than the final version. And that speaks a little bit to some of the sort of complexities that we have in the open access space. So the reason why we started doing this study, why we thought it's a good idea to understand what the open access policy landscape is in Australia, was because of the work done by a group in Western Australia, the COKI, which is the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative. And they did a whole heap of work that looked at what was happening in the open access space, not the policy space, the actual what was being made open access over time in different parts of the world. And this particular graph that is actually a graph that moves, you can see it over time. So it's a screen grab of it. What it's showing is that the red dots are the Australasia, Australia and New Zealand kind of area, and that they haven't shifted very much over time, whereas a lot of the other areas, the pinks and the greens and the browns, have moved significantly into much larger amounts of work being open access, either because it's been published open access, or it's gold open access, or because a copy's been put into a repository, as in green open access. And you can sort of see different policies influence there about which kind of direction on that graph they've gone. But the reality was that not very much Australian material was being made open access while there was a lot of other activity overseas. So we wanted to understand, is this because our open access policies landscape needs addressing? And so what we found, that despite the National Health and Medical Research Council having a requirement for open access, more than 30% of those publications weren't open access. So even in situations where there was a funder requirement, there still was not very much of material open access. So clearly there was a problem. In Australia, the responsibility for policy is devolved to institutions. So we have a sort of very important document in Australia called the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. And the code, as it's referred to, is where all of our questions about research integrity and reproducibility and how people should manage their data, and all of those sorts of questions are kind of held in the code. And what in that code, there's also some recommendations and some guidelines. And one of those is to say that research institutions have the responsibility to develop and implement policies. So clearly all universities should have an open access policy. Now, we had to define what we meant by an open access policy, because sometimes there might be some information on a library webpage about open access, or there might be a departmental policy that says we'd like all of the publications from this department to be made open access. So we said, no, it needs to be quite defined. It needs to be called an open access policy. So not just a policy that talks about research publications and mentions open access as part of that policy, but it also needed to be in a university site. So it not sitting on a library or a departmental site. So that was how we sort of defined it. And what we did was we looked at the website that collected policies. We looked from Australia. We looked at an international website that collected policies. And then if we couldn't find something through there, we checked the university website for policy to reach the policy library. And then we checked any policy for terms using these specific terms that might relate to open access. And then if there were none of those, we searched for procedures and guidelines. And then if there was nothing at all, we'd just do a general search across the whole university website to see if there was any mention of open access at all. Now, there's 41 Australian universities, or there were in 2020. And what it turned out was only 20 of them actually had an open access policy. So there were some that mentioned open access, there were some that referenced open access elsewhere, and there were 8, which is a significant number of 41, that didn't have anything that referred to open access that was official. So that in itself was a bit disappointing. And then we thought, let's have a look at these institution policies. This is the University of Helsinki's library. It's a beautiful library if you ever get an opportunity to go there. So these are the factors that we were looking at in relation to what the policy was mentioning. And some of these relate to Australia. So if you're considering your institutional policies, you wouldn't be looking at the Australian funders like the Australian Research Council or the National Health and Medical Research Council. You'd be looking at your funding bodies that are relevant to your area of the world. So one of the things we looked at was what definition of open access was being used in the policy. And the reason why we considered this is because open access is quite complex. And while people think they know what open access is or what they're talking about when they talk about open access, in reality, you can have a conversation with somebody where the two of you are actually talking at cross purposes, because what one person thinks is open access is quite different to what another person thinks is. And if we want to think about, and I would like to think that we are talking about having a national discussion about open access in Australia. So it's quite important we all agree on what it is we're even talking about. So we thought, let's have a look at what is the definition of open access in these policies. And it turned out that there isn't a lot of consolidation. So here are some common open access definitions. The main one, of course, being the 2002 that was updated then in 2012 Budapest Open Access Initiative definition. It was pretty much the first definition of open access. And there are some other ones there. So that was what we were looking for. And what we discovered was that 18 of the 20 policies had a definition, and rather worryingly, 2 did not. So of the 20, 10% of them, 2 of them didn't have a definition at all. So it's not at all clear even what they mean by open access. Of the 18 that did have a definition, only 2 had a reference of what where they got their definition from. The rest of them had no definition. And what that means then is that we don't have an agreed understanding of what it is we're referring to when we refer to open access. Now, it's good for us to consider what are the factors of a policy that will make a policy successful. And this article is a very interesting one that was published a few years ago in relation to what mandates for open access are authors complying with. And the factors that seem to be quite important, and it's not surprising in some ways, is that the longer you wait past the publication time for the person to actually do something about open access, the less likely there will be compliance. And the other factor is if there's no infrastructure to support the requirement to make work open access. And the third factor is if there is no consequence for not complying. So what we need is something that's close to the time of publication. We need there to be a consequence for not complying with the funders or the mandate, and we also need to have infrastructure to support it for a policy to be successful. So what we looked at was, let's look at this compliance question. And so we thought, what are the words being used in the policy? And you can see that some of these words are calls to action. They are words to say you must do this, researchers will do this, the university requires it, the material is to be deposited, there's a mandate, should be. Now these all have, and I understand that I'm speaking to different people who don't all come from an English as their first language background, you will have equivalents in your own languages about what are the words that say this has to happen, and what are the words that say we would like this to happen. The ones that say it has to happen are much stronger. Then we looked at the question of deposit time, and there's lots and lots of information on this slide, and it's just some pull outs from the different policies. And what we've sort of got is differences here. So we've got one that says after 3 months of publication, there's trying to avoid more than 12 months, no later than 12 months, 12 months. So it's quite prevalent. But we've got a couple, like there's one from the USA that talks about as soon as is practicable. Well, that's a bit, what does that even mean? As soon as possible, again, that's a bit undefined. Edith Cowan talks about after their acceptance for publication, and that's quite interesting. I'll come to that in a moment. So these are the ones that are quite quick, they're quite soon. So we've got the within 3 months of publication, at the time of publication, or after their acceptance for publication, which could be before they're actually published. And it's important to think about the infrastructure that supports that requirement. So we talked about the third thing being the infrastructure. So if we're talking about upon acceptance for publication, you need to have a way of that making sense. So here's an example on the left-hand side where it's in the repository. The article is not able to be made available yet because it's under some kind of embargo, but you can request a copy of it as a reader. So while it's not publicly available in the repository, there is a way for somebody who comes across this article and says, I'm interested in this, I'd like to see it. They can click a button and then they can access a copy of it. Now, there's quite a lot of technology that sits behind that. So this is what we mean by putting the infrastructure in to make sure that your policy is going to make sense. It's going to be easy for the user, both the author, and also easy for the person who wants to find things in your repository. We also looked at what kind of exceptions could be factored in. So a lot of the policies said, you must do this except for these circumstances. And so there's a list here. And actually, some of those are the same thing. So when they talk about publisher agreements or copyright agreements or publisher versions of non-open access publications, these things are pretty much the same thing. So they refer to similar things. And that means that actually the person putting those policies together probably wasn't fully aware of some of the nuances in here. So you do need to have your policy at least looked over by somebody who understands the nuance in this space. It's a complicated space. We also said, are there any compliance consequences, which we know is one of the 3 things that will make a policy effective. And in fact, very few. And those, there were only 3 mentions, and they talked about, we may do something if you don't comply, which is pretty weak. And in fact, in most of these cases, it's probably just, that's the conditions under which they're employed anyway. So there really aren't any consequences. There was also, and I won't go into this in detail, but we asked about whether or not the university supported or didn't support or was silent on the question of paying for publication. And you can see that that's quite a messy graph. So the takeaways from this study, this is one of the many beautiful libraries I went to in the UK, and it's not a beautiful part of the library, but I took this photograph actually because of the sprinkler system. So that's why the photograph is there. So what we found were there were differences across the different policies in relation to quite a few factors. So there was no consistency across the country. And this is a problem if we want to have a countrywide conversation about open access. So these are really the things that you probably want to consider if you want to build a good policy that's going to be effective. So I'm just going to do the second part about the policy. This is from their library in Birmingham, which has won enormous amounts of international awards. It's truly extraordinary building. Here are some good resources that you can use in terms of advocacy in your institution. So the Council of Australian University Librarians has created an open educational resources advocacy toolkit. So that's a toolkit to try and encourage universities and individuals to adopt using open textbooks in their teaching processes and factors to try and reduce the cost for students in terms of textbooks. While this whole toolkit is angled towards open educational resources, the tools in there can be adapted very easily to the process of introducing a new policy. So there's many downloads of forms that you can use. There's workshops that you can run. There's processes you can go through to understand your thinking. So that's a very useful toolkit that I can highly recommend as one that you might want to use if you are trying to implement a policy in your institution. So here's some examples of what you can do, like creating an action plan. And there's lots of different sort of ideas about what are the opportunities you can use to advocate for a policy. How do you gather evidence to support what you're trying to put forward? Who are your stakeholders? What are some scenarios? And here's another good resource at the risk of promoting myself. This is a process, a course that I have run with my colleague, Sarah Shreves from the University of Arizona for several years for something called FISCI, which is the Force 11 Scholarly Communications Institute. All the videos and slides are available. It's freely available in the Open Science Forum. And so you can have a look at the online videos and tutorials there and understand a process to go through to understand advocacy and how to process something through your institution. The summary of what is covered there is it's very important to understand who your stakeholders are.
Dr. Dani, sorry, you have 2 minutes, please.
And that's good timing. And this is pretty much my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you.
To understand who your stakeholders are, who are the key people who benefit and don't benefit from your policy. And also the important thing is, how are decisions made in your institution? We need to understand what is the perspective of the people who are going to be affected by that policy. And you need to think about why those stakeholders might not agree with the policy. What are the things they will disagree with, so that you can think about how to respond to those issues that they have. And the question is, how prepared are you? Do you have the support, workflow, and infrastructure in place to implement your policy? You must remember, developing and implementing a policy takes a long time. You are going well if you can do it in a year. It is likely to take more like 2 or even possibly 3 years. And that is the end of my presentation. Just understand this isn't simple, but there are resources online and there are many people who can help you. So that's the end of my presentation.
And thank you for the kind invitation. I appreciate it. Nice to meet you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry, it's very dark outside where I am. It's just after midnight. So good morning to you. Good evening to my colleague in Australia. It's lovely to bring everyone together around this important topic. My Twitter handle is here. If you'd like to follow up or ask questions, you can follow me at cgreen. And my email is just cable@creativecommons.org. Happy to talk after as well. Today, we're going to talk kind of in three parts. Talk a little bit about open licensing, a little bit about solving the world's biggest challenges, and then how that leads into various open access models. So for those, just to level set the conversation, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with Creative Commons and what we do, we create and steward the open licenses that the world uses to share copyrighted works. And so when we're talking about open access research, open licenses are foundational and a very important part of open access research, because open access research is either openly licensed or in the public domain. And the global OA community uses standard international open licenses. They use the Creative Commons licenses. If you don't know us, we are a nonprofit organization. As I mentioned, we steward these licenses. We've been around now for just over 20 years. In fact, we're having our 20th anniversary this year. We operate worldwide. The licenses work in every country in the world. And in addition to these legal tools, we have teams of people in countries around the world, including, I saw Saudi Arabia there, Australia, and many other countries. So we have this global network of experts who can help provide support around Creative Commons tools and what they mean for open access research, open science, open educational resources, open data, and other sectors of open, including galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, and other spaces where we work. The licenses themselves are free to use. In fact, we've dedicated our licenses to the public domain, so they're there forever. These licenses have been proven over the last 2 decades. They have become essentially the international de facto standard for open copyright licensing. I want to be clear, these are not tools for patents or other forms of intellectual property. They are for opening up copyrighted works, which almost everything we do in research falls into that category. Almost everything we do in education falls into that category. So they're used to open up those resources. The licenses are not anti-copyright. They actually respect copyright and sit on top of copyright law. The licenses are robust. They've never once lost in a court of law in 20 years, and we have case law from countries around the world. And we've worked very closely with the open access research community and been a key part of that for the last 2 decades as well. Our vision at Creative Commons is quite simple, and that is to build a world where knowledge and culture are equitably shared in ways that serve the public interest or the public good, if you will. And so as we plan our programs and decide where we'll spend our time, it's always about how do we best serve the public interest, not only with the licenses, but with our programs in education and open journalism and open GLAM and other areas, open science, open access research. The licenses, which I won't go into today, but they look like this. We've got 6 different open copyright licenses to public domain tools. This is what people use to share. So Dr. Kingsley, I was very pleased to see all over her slides, her work was licensed with a Creative Commons attribution license or the CC BY license. And that was her signal to all of us and to the public that we may use her work for free. And we need to give her attribution when we do so. We need to list the title, the author, the source, and the license when we reuse her work. And we thank her for her contributions to the Commons. So we very proudly say that we put the open in open access, as Dr. Kingsley was saying. Definitions are very important, and part of the definition of most open things are their legal status. And so it's very important that we understand and talk about licensing and the legal rights to use works that we mean to be open and mean to be in the Commons. So let me shift to the second point. Creative Commons is 20 years old. We're very happy about that. We're celebrating the last 20 years, and that's fun. But mostly what we're interested in doing is looking forward to the next 20 years. And so we're asking ourselves questions like this. If we are going to solve the world's biggest problems, the greatest challenges that humanity has at the moment, what should we be doing? And part of our answer to that is that the knowledge and the culture about those problems, about those challenges, must be open if we are going to solve them. And so, well, what are the world's greatest challenges? What's the list? Well, there are many lists out there, and different countries have different lists that make sense for them. But what the world has decided on through the United Nations General Assembly is what's called the Sustainable Development Goals. These are a collection of 17 goals that are meant to provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity and for the planet. And these goals are meant to be largely accomplished by the year 2030. And there's still a lot of work to be done. The Sustainable Development Goals look like this. They're things like affordable and clean energy, making sure people have enough food to eat, SDG 4, ensuring that there's quality education opportunities for everyone. And I'll focus a little bit on number 13, climate action today. And so our thesis at Creative Commons is that if we want to realize these UN Sustainable Development Goals, that we need the knowledge, the research data, the educational resources, the software, the open hardware, et cetera, about these challenges to be freely available, and not just free, but also open, openly licensed, not behind paywalls, easy to download, because if we don't have access to this knowledge, it's going to be difficult to solve the problems. Let me focus on climate change just for a minute. It's something that we're all dealing with. The world is warming. I can tell you, I live here in Olympia, Washington, and it rains a lot, but it hasn't been raining. It just barely started. It's about a month overdue. So our climate has changed quite a bit as well. And so we're focusing right now on one of our projects on climate change and the resulting harm and challenges to global biodiversity as being one of the many SDGs that are the world's most pressing problems. And no surprise, but open sharing of the research outputs on climate is not the default. It's too often the exception. And so how much of the climate change knowledge or publications is open access? Just like Dr. Kingsley, I'm going to cite Koki in Australia. We're working with them as well. And they did an analysis from 1980 to 2020. There were over 169,000 articles or research publications specifically about climate change. And over 57% of those were closed. Good news, almost 43% were open, but still the majority of the climate research in the world is closed. And yet most of that research, an overwhelming amount of that research was funded with public money from governments around the world. And yet the public that paid for the research can't get access to it. So it looks something like this. You know, if all of these little dots were climate researchers, environmental groups, governments, institutes, maybe ministries of science in different countries who are learning things about climate, they're collecting data, they're publishing, but because 57% of this research is behind paywalls, if you are a university that doesn't have a massive budget in your library system to subscribe to all of the journals that you need, you don't get access to this research. Before I was at Creative Commons, I worked for community and technical colleges, or sometimes called TVETs in different countries. These schools do not have the library budgets to subscribe to expensive journals, which sometimes can be upwards of $15,000 to $20,000 US a year. In open access, we've also shifted in many ways to article processing charges, or APCs, where you have to, after your article is accepted, you have to pay essentially a submission fee. And those can be very expensive as well. So if you are a scholar from a country that is maybe under-resourced and doesn't have those kinds of funds to pay those article processing charges, then even though you've done the research and you have important knowledge and data, maybe educational resources to share, you don't have the article processing fee to get it into a journal to make it open access. And so you're not published. And that's problematic as well. And so we need to break that wall down. Around climate, we've built a coalition with our partners at Spark and Eiffel and two funders in this space, the Open Society Foundations and the Arcadia Fund out of the United Kingdom. And we have created something that we call the Open Climate Campaign. And the Open Climate Campaign, which you can see the URL, it's just openclimatecampaign.org. I'll share this in the chat as well after the session, is quite simply focused on opening up all of the research and the research data and where we can get it, the educational resources and other knowledge around climate and biodiversity. And we have an entire campaign laid out. If you're interested in the details or want to receive our newsletter, you can sign up on the website. So what we did was we asked, when we were thinking about launching this campaign and we're thinking about future models of open access, we took a step back and said, well, why is it that we do science in the first place? Why do we publish our research? And we believe fundamentally that knowledge is a public good, and that public goods need to be funded by the public. And so the good news is with research, overwhelmingly the research, most of the research in the world is funded with public money. Unfortunately, much of that publicly funded research gets locked up behind paywalls and does not become a public good, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. As we think about open access models, and you all are talking about open access models at your universities and in your countries, one thing to keep in mind is that if research and if science are about learning about our world, about our universe, about flora and fauna and people and the way that we interact, and if part of what we're trying to do is to solve challenges, to solve big problems like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, then we don't just need an efficient or an effective scholarly publishing system. We need one that's socially just as well. And of all the definitions out there, I'm fond of the European University Association definition, which is on the screen here. And they say a just scholarly publication ecosystem is transparent, it's diverse, it's economically affordable and sustainable. This is key. It's technically interoperable, and steered by the research community and its institutions through coordinated policies. I'm going to come back to that point in just a moment as well. So if we were going to create an open access model from scratch today, how would we do that in a way that we could share the knowledge, the research, the data, educational resources, et cetera, in the most effective, efficient, equitable, and socially just manner? Well, at Creative Commons, I lead our open knowledge work. So I lead our work in open education, open science, and open access research. We have a set of 6 principles that guide us in our work and deciding where we're going to spend our time. First is that we fundamentally believe that publicly funded knowledge, including research, should be openly licensed by default or placed directly into the public domain. For OA research, our recommendation to governments and institutions is CC BY, or the Creative Commons Attribution License on articles, CC 0, or the public domain dedication on the data, and a 0 embargo period. Quite simply, the license is to make sure that the articles can be text and data mined. Really, we don't have time today to talk about this, but it's an important part of next-gen research and science. Most data is already in the public domain. CC 0 just is very clear about that. And 0 embargo period means at the moment of publication, the public gets access to that publicly funded work. Second, that public funds allocated to produce knowledge, including research, should be spent as effectively and efficiently as possible. We shouldn't be wasting public money, and we should be maximizing the public good. That leads us to certain open access models and not to others. Third, publicly funded knowledge should be stewarded by public institutions, the academy, and/or trusted nonprofits. One of the big challenges we have right now in the open access and the research space in general is that a lot of the knowledge which is funded by the public is locked up behind paywalls in commercial entities. And this is not a shot at commercial entities at all. Their job is to generate a profit, to make incomes. They have public shareholders in many cases. Many of them are public companies. And that's their job, is to maximize revenue. But that's not necessarily, we believe, the purpose of science or research. We believe that it's fundamentally about being a public good and solving big problems. Fourth, equity should be at the core of any open knowledge model. Today, as I mentioned, we have major equity problems with the way that research is either subscribed to so that people can read it, or the ability to contribute to research journals is hampered significantly by article processing charges. Fifth,
Dr. Cable, you have about 3 minutes.
Very good. I'll wrap this up. Thank you. We talked a little bit about open procurement. This is not to say that we shouldn't work with commercial organizations. We absolutely should. And when we do, the public should hire those services, but retain copyright. Because as the last point says, when copyrighted works are produced with publicly funded knowledge, that should be held by the authors or the researchers or the public institution that funded that knowledge. We should retain those copyrights. This is often referred to as rights retention. And so when we look at all the various open access models, the one that's very interesting to us at the moment is called Diamond Open Access, where you don't have subscription fees, you don't have article processing charges. They're largely publicly funded or institution funded, run in a very efficient way, and we remove the unequitable models that we have today. So this is a space that we're watching very closely and staying involved with the conversations. People often ask, well, what's the sustainability model, the revenue model? Well, we think the answer to that's very simple, and that is that we should be funding research as a public good, and that the public should be funding these. Last slide here. This is hard, right? Change is not easy. As Dr. Kingsley said, policy change takes a long time, a lot of conversations with stakeholders. But we need to do this if we want to solve the world's most pressing challenges, do so with a model of open access that's equitable and allows everyone to participate, and to ensure that publicly funded knowledge is a public good that's accessible to everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all very much for having me. Let me just do this real quickly. Yeah. I'd like to talk about, for the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to talk about the need for culturally and linguistically diverse open educational resources to allow for meaningful and high impact learning experiences, particularly amongst marginalized communities in remote or often underrepresented areas. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about how we can do that in the MENA region. So in line with SDG 4, I'm very grateful to Dr. Green for having introduced the Sustainable Development Goals already. Thank you for that. In line with SDG 4, open education has long promised to democratize education and provide opportunities for lifelong learning to learners around the globe. Open educational resources, or OER, are often promoted for this realization and implementation, for the actions called for through SDG 4, which are to ensure inclusive and quality education for all and promote lifelong learning. Professor Rory McGreal, who's a UNESCO chair in OER, lists several ways in which OER are well suited to realize this sustainable development goal in learning, namely to increase access for learning for those living in unfavorable circumstances, as OER are free of licensing restrictions, can be freely and widely distributed, and as such, they can be highly effective in ensuring equitable access to knowledge and learning. So in this presentation, I'd really like to focus on the use of OER for the realization of SDG 4 in the MENA region, and particularly for adult learners. And in the next slide, you'll see that there really is a need for equitable access to knowledge and learning within the region. So in line with global developments, the labor market in the MENA region is rapidly evolving. There's an increasing need for youth to be trained and upskilled for new technologies needed to succeed at work. And over the next 20 years, 127 million people will be entering a labor market with 23% unemployment. And it's estimated that by 2030, 29 million jobs are at risk of being displaced by automation, if the labor force isn't able to keep up with new skills needed in an increasingly tech-enabled labor market. So within this need for constant reskilling, the idea of a career for life doesn't really apply anymore, or certainly not as much as it would have for a previous generation. Youth entering the labor market will likely hold a variety of positions in their professional lives, needing varying skill sets. And that's where lifelong learning opportunities through open education initiatives stand to make a significant impact in the region, considering this need for constant upskilling to meet the demands of the market. So what are the most common open education initiatives available today for learners around the globe? Well, massive online open courses, or MOOCs, are by far the most popular open education resources for learners around the globe. In fact, they've become the norm. According to the MOOC aggregator site Class Central, which is at classcentral.com, last year alone, 950 universities offered over 19,000 MOOCs to 220 million learners. So what are MOOCs? Well, MOOCs are web-based courses offered for learners around the world, usually at little or no cost, regardless of learners' age, race, social, or educational status. The learner population of a MOOC can run into the hundreds or thousands, and it's often much more culturally diverse than a conventional online course, as it draws learners from around the globe. MOOCs are seen as a significant factor in meeting the UN and UNESCO's educational goal. So with an open access learning content solution perceived to be in place, MOOCs, development aid and other funding to implement this solution has been generally focused on infrastructure and technological access to learning. So spurred on by the pandemic, there have been some fantastic initiatives to provide technological access to learning to marginalized communities in remote areas. One example is Airtel Africa, a leading provider of telecommunications in Africa, and UNICEF, who jointly announced a 5-year partnership in October of last year to accelerate the rollout of digital learning by ensuring free access to learning platforms across 13 countries in Africa. In Jordan, a similar initiative in 2020 involved partnerships with national telecom companies to guarantee free roaming of the Darsak e-learning portal, their national portal, between 6 a.m. and 4 p.m. So students wouldn't have to worry about incurring internet charges. Now, of course, these initiatives are sorely needed. We can all agree on that. But equally important is a focus on the learning design to address the needs of diverse learners around the globe within the content presented. So what are they actually seeing? We're giving them the technological access to the content, but equally important is what they're actually being presented with once they have access. So that begs the question, MOOCs, the most popular form of open education for adult learners, are they able to address the diverse needs of learners around the globe? Well, given the practical challenges of facilitating such large class sizes in the hundreds or even thousands, MOOCs often take a one-size-fits-all approach, where materials are offered in a single format and language or via direct machine translations. Learners enrolled in MOOCs, however, they have extremely diverse motivations and demographic backgrounds. Most MOOCs, unfortunately, are most relevant only to native speakers of the language the course was originally written in, and most relevant to the culture the MOOC most refers to. For example, a MOOC created by an American expert or university will often use American examples and case studies and references to describe a concept, a situation, or an event. And these examples will resonate most with learners that identify most with American culture. Makes sense. An additional barrier to learning is that institutions can have ulterior motives to creating MOOCs. Given the high number of users that visit the large MOOC sites like Coursera and edX, MOOCs are often used as marketing tools to expand an institution's reach, to build reputation, and to maintain brand identity. Lastly, many MOOC providers are moving away from a strictly open access model. Coursera and edX, two of the largest MOOC providers, both exited the open access space last year. the MOOC promise of free education for everyone, everywhere, seems to be compromised. Well, the most significant cultural barrier to learning, however, is the lack of linguistic diversity in MOOCs. This chart shows the number of courses offered by the top 6 MOOC providers. So we have Udemy, Coursera, LinkedIn Learning, YouTube Learning, edX, and FutureLearn. So we're ranging from around 22,000 courses on Udemy to 3,500 courses on FutureLearn, still not a small amount. Towards the middle of the chart, Coursera and LinkedIn Learning have an offering of roughly 12 to 13,000 courses each. Big numbers too. So to review the level of linguistic diversity amongst the top 6 MOOC providers, I used data from Class Central to evaluate to see how many courses each of these providers offers in different languages. More specifically, how many courses are originally written in different languages, not machine translated from another language. So before we look at that data of which languages are most represented amongst the top MOOC providers, here's a high-level overview of the proportion of native speakers of 5 of the most spoken languages in the world. So you can see that Mandarin is dominant, after that Hindi, and then roughly equal amounts between English, Arabic, and Spanish. As you can see, about 13% of the world's population speaks English as a native language. And that's notable for what we're going to see on the next slide. When we look at how many MOOCs are offered in these top languages, the vast majority of them are offered in English, right? 90%, with only 1% coverage across Arabic, Hindi, and Mandarin. Now, although there have been technologically advanced initiatives to translate MOOCs into different languages using mostly machine translation, the technology isn't yet able to address the cultural nuances needed in language translation for content to fully resonate with a learner in a secondary course language. And we're probably all familiar with the expression lost in translation, and that certainly applies here. Machine translation isn't really able to pick up on those expressions in the way that we would want them to create impact in learning. So most adult learners around the world are facing linguistic, cultural, and financial barriers when accessing learning through the most used MOOC providers. Well, MOOCs, they shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all model due to the unconformable body of adult learners from diverse cultures. To create high-impact learning experiences, we really need more culturally relevant and linguistically diverse MOOCs and OER in general, open educational resources in general, to address the needs of learners of particular demographics and facing specific local challenges. There are, of course, examples of open education initiatives that are relevant to adult learners of specific cultures, which is great, facing very specific challenges as well. So I don't want to just be a naysayer and say all this is wrong. There are certainly things going on that are great. So I'd like to just highlight 3 of those examples. Firstly, the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services in America recognized and used the strong cultural tradition in El Salvador of passing down oral history through folk songs by developing a program for asylum seekers from El Salvador to know their legal rights when arriving at the US border, by replacing lyrics of commonly known folk songs and having roaming musical groups sing the songs and teach the new lyrics to those who pass by. This would be en route traveling through to the US border. So not only was the legal information easier to remember in familiar song form, but they could pass it on to others they met on the way, overcoming barriers in literacy and resources, simple things like pen and paper or internet access. A second example is Migrant Rights, or migrantrights.org. They're a nonprofit organization set up to protect the rights of migrant workers throughout the Middle East. And they've created a simulation for low-income migrant workers facing limited and difficult choices, often due to their travel papers being withheld as part of the kafala or work visa system that's prevalent here in the GCC region. The simulation is directly aimed at low-income migrant workers in GCC countries, giving different options along the way according to which scenario may best represent their current situation. So it's really speaking to them and putting them in control of the content they're being presented with. For each of the various scenarios the simulation can conclude with, learners are then shown links to resources and local organizations they can contact for further support. Finally, the third and last example here, UNICEF has launched the Youth Learning Passport Initiative in Jordan, along with the Jordanian government, in 2020, as a critical bridge to help disadvantaged youth, especially girls, refugees, and adolescents with disabilities who are most at risk of long-term unemployment, to access online training on digital skills and the English language to prepare young adults for an increasingly digital workplace. So that's kind of coming back to what I'd mentioned earlier about the labor market in the MENA region changing and becoming more technologically driven. Youth Learning Passports training courses are available in English and Arabic, and they can also be downloaded for offline learning through the app. So why do these three examples of OER work? What makes them successful in ensuring impact? Well, most importantly, they identify a specific and often urgent need for learning, and they develop accordingly. And this is what creates impact. They also make learning immediately applicable and relevant to a specific group of learners. And that's, of course, much more difficult to do in a MOOC where you have thousands of learners enrolled. They also directly address and leverage those learners' backgrounds and prior experiences through problem-centered training that focuses on a particular problem that needs to be resolved. Now, that problem may only be relevant to a specific regional and cultural demographic, thereby automatically ensuring cultural relevance of the learning materials and subsequently higher engagement, higher knowledge retention, higher skills transfer, in short, higher impact. So what can we learn from these initiatives? Well, the main lesson that we can learn is that we need to work with local organizations and expertise to create content that is relevant and specific to the needs of learners of a certain region. Putting the learner first, local organizations can help us answer questions about the learners, like what challenges do they face specifically? What are the specific knowledge or skills gaps that can be filled to make a significant socioeconomic impact? Well, this, of course, requires extensive analysis before any learning content is ever written or developed, and it requires insights from within the target demographic audience and a close relationship with representative groups on the ground, those being local organizations and local expertise. This is a crucial step that's often overlooked when thinking about how to make access to learning open to disenfranchised or marginalized communities in remote areas. Developing high-impact learning experiences, therefore, requires collaborative efforts between government or funding bodies, local organizations, and learning designers and learning developers. So how can Knology help build high-impact and meaningful learning experiences? Well, within our training and consulting division, we have a team of learning designers and developers that are currently building courses and programs in English and Arabic for professional development of academics and researchers. Those same courses are being offered in English and fully in Arabic. We also have a learning platform in place for online self-paced learning in English or Arabic with downloadable content for learners in areas with limited internet connectivity. And lastly, we have a vast network of subject matter experts built up through many years of providing training solutions, many with MENA-specific expertise. So we feel that we're ready to contribute to building learning experiences that are culturally relevant to groups within the MENA region. At the Knology Foundation,
I say you have like 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. This is my last little bit. At the Knology Foundation, we're interested in working with government and funding bodies and organizations who represent marginalized communities to create open access learning opportunities that speak directly to the needs, values, interests, challenges, and cultural subtleties of these communities. So we strongly believe that designing learning materials within this measure of inclusivity has the potential for significant impact in the region. Please do get in touch with us at digitaltraining@knowledge.com, or you can use the discussion forum on the forum website. If you have any questions or comments about what I've presented today, please also feel free to leave some questions in the Q&A. And if you're interested in collaborating on building these types of culturally relevant learning experiences that address urgent needs of communities in the region, we'd love to hear from you as well. Thank you for your time.
We can start, check the box. I have about, I can pick like a 4 question to 5 questions from here. The first is about how do you see the future of education in the next 10 years? How do you see the future of education on the next 10 years? I think this may question direct to Dr. Dani, maybe.
I've got some interesting perspectives on that. I'm rather concerned about what I'm seeing in relation to publishers very much moving into the education space. I can see collaborations that are happening, partnerships that are happening between publishers and universities to develop courses. Google is developing courses. In fact, in Australia, our industry minister said just last week, there is no need for a degree anymore. People do not need degrees. So there does seem to be a sort of breaking up of education into smaller and smaller pieces, which has benefits, but also does make me concerned about it becoming purely a commercial enterprise, and also in that process the loss of any deep thought and ability to critically analyze. So I'm not sure if that's what the question was asking, but that's my position about where I think education's going.
Okay, thank you for your answer. There is a question from Victoria. Actually, the questions, do we need prior consent or like an approval from the journals if we submit our paper in a preprint portal?
That's a very quick answer, actually. The best thing to do is to look at the author guidelines in a journal. So some journals will actually ask you to submit your paper through a preprint server. So there are some which require you to make your work available in a preprint prior to publication or for submission. But there are still some journals that will not consider your paper if it is available as a preprint. So my suggestion is to check the author guidelines, and if it's not clear from the author guidelines, to contact the journal prior to doing so, because you don't want to be in a position where means you can't submit a paper to the journal you wish because you have it up as a preprint.
Thank you, Dr. Dani.
Can I add just one? Would it be okay if I added one more thing?
Sure. Go ahead, Doctor.
Completely agree with Dr. Kingsley. That is sound advice. And as researchers and as authors, one of the things that we can do if we want to publish preprints is to start to tell, and not ask, but to tell the journals, I will be publishing my work as a preprint, and those are my terms. And if you'd like to publish my journal after I publish in preprint, I'd like to publish with you, but I am going to publish. And so, for example, when I'm asked to write book chapters, I tell the editors, I'd be happy to write the chapter, and my chapter will be licensed under a Creative Commons attribution license. If you don't like those terms, then that's okay, but I won't be writing a book chapter for you. And so as authors, we need to take some of that power and that authority and to state our terms and not always just give in to the terms of the journal.
Thank you, Dr. Cable. I have also a question from Dr. Sayed. What are the challenges and problems in open access academic research publication and how to overcome from it? I'm not sure, maybe Dr. Cable or Dr. Dani, are you able to answer this question? I will repeat the question again. What are the challenges and problems in open access academic research publication and how to overcome from it?
I think that if somebody has the answer to that, then we can all go home. So, because that is a very big question. There are many problems. Some of them are technical. Simple things like it's difficult for us in a library to put open resources into our catalogue because the metadata, the information about the open resources, isn't in a form that we can add to our catalogue. So that's one example of an infrastructure problem. So another one is sometimes the open access publication outlets might not be seen as to be as prestigious as another place to publish. And so somebody may not wish to publish somewhere because they are needing to publish in certain types of journals for them to get a promotion. And so a lot of the issues to do with more dissemination of open research comes back to the issue of the way we reward researchers and the kinds of things that we say are valued in the research endeavour. And often that's publication in certain journals. And the reason why those certain journals are valued relates to, unfortunately, the way the university ranking systems operate. And the university rankings have done an enormous amount of damage to the entire research endeavour because it's forcing people to behave in a certain way to meet certain requirements for universities to chase what is actually a mirage and not even real. So that's the real problem. If we can find a solution for university rankings, then I think we're having a different conversation.
Appreciate Dr. Dani. Maybe Dr. Cable, you have an input, please.
I think that's all spot on. Really good advice. And Dr. Kingsley called out another one in her slides, which was even when funders have open access policies and open licensing policies, oftentimes they're not enforced. And so one of the things that we do at Creative Commons is we help institutions and governments create open policies, open access policies. We help them get them adopted, but we also stay with them and help them implement. So we'll train the staff and the program officers, and we'll have webinars with the grantees so that people understand it. But in the end, as Dr. Kingsley said, what it really takes is for the funder to tell its grantees, look, we're really serious. And if you don't make your work open access and openly license it in the way that we've told you that you need to, then frankly, the odds of you getting another grant from us, the government, or us, the foundation, are low. And so you need to be compliant with our policy requirement. And when the funder does that, compliance is very high. It also is funder requirements give the faculty and the researchers political cover in many cases, because they can say, well, I have to make this open access because the funder is requiring me to do so. And that's helpful if maybe their faculty senate at the university has not already adopted an open access policy for the university, or maybe their department chair is saying that they need to publish in, as Dr. Kingsley said, this high impact journal or that high impact journal. But for the professor who got the grant that has an open access requirement can say, look, I have to publish open access. And there's a lot of ways to do that. As we've discussed, green, gold, diamond, there's many pathways to complying with those open access requirements.
Thank you, Dr. Cable. Also, there is a question here about what's the problems teachers face in addressing culture and linguistic diversity and open education system. Anyone may interest to answer this question? Maybe Aisa? You are muted.
Yeah, I was muted. Sorry, I was muted there. I started talking already. Hopefully you can hear me now. Yeah, so in the open education, addressing cultural and linguistic diversity, what are the problems? Probably the biggest problem is just capacity and resources. So I think as teacher, if you're creating an open educational resource, you'd like that to be spread far and wide. And that's pretty much what they're made for, to be seen by as many people as possible at a low cost or at no cost. The issue comes in how you're going to be able to ensure impact, or how is that going to be a meaningful learning experience for someone who's not able to relate to either your position or your examples or the way that you're choosing to teach that subject or that concept. Don't get me wrong. I think the premise of open educational resources is fantastic, and I'm of course a huge supporter of it. I think we do have some particular challenges around capacity and resources for making those same resources relevant to groups outside of the ones that they may have been originally written for. And these are initiatives that are going to have to come from a higher level to provide funding to be able to alter those resources, those open educational resources, and not just through machine translation, which is usually a solution for linguistic diversity, but through human translation, which is expensive, and the editing of the content, which is expensive as well. So I think those are some of the problems that we face.
Thank you.
And, Isaac, you pointed out in your slides that I think it was over 90% of the MOOC courses, some of which are OER and some of which are not, but are in English, right? And that's a major problem. And just a part of open is the licensing part of it. And so when the educational resources are either under a Creative Commons license or in the public domain, we all collectively have the legal rights to translate, to modify for local use. Some of the first sharing I did under CC licenses was actually with colleagues in Australia who saw my course and said, hey, this looks really interesting. Could we take it? And I said, sure, it's under a Creative Commons license. And I said, well, what are you going to do with it? And they said, well, first, we're going to get the correct English spellings on things, because you Americans don't know how to spell things. Second, we're going to take out all your examples of Northwest United States bears and pine trees, and we're going to put in examples for our students that make sense in Australia. And the reason they were able to do all of that contextualization and localization was because it was openly licensed. And so that's not the only learning design thing, obviously, but it's a kind of an infrastructure part of what we need to do when we share.
Thank you, Dr. Cable. I will take the last question from the Q&A box. It's how can we be confident if we public editable data to prevent distribution? I will repeat the question again. How can we be confident if we public editable data to prevent distribution? I'm not sure.
So that's, sure. I think this could be, it's to prevent distortion. So I think that there's possibly two things this question's asking. So one is if we make a data set available publicly, and that data set is editable, so it can be changed after you make it available, there are potentially problems if I then refer to version 1 of that data and it gets changed, and then somebody else has done some work to it and they want to check my work, but what they're looking at is version 2 of that work. So one of the ways to manage this, and this comes again back to infrastructure, is to ensure there is a way of taking a capture of different versions of it so that you can then identify which version of that data you're using. So that's that answer. But the question could also be asking, and sometimes this is a concern for people who make their research data openly available, is if it might be used for a purpose it was not intended for. And so I've had this conversation with researchers who say, what if the software that I'm making openly available is used to create a bomb that then kills people? It is not the reason why I developed this. And so that is a concern about making, and you really don't have control over what happens to your data after it goes out into the public. So if that's what the question is asking, the answer is yes, that is a potential problem. The risk is small, but it is out there as a problem.
Thank you, Dr. Dani. I think we came to the end of the session today. I would like to thanks Dr. Dani and Dr. Cable and Mr. Isa for joining us today. Thank you for the valuable information that you're sharing with us.